Hey everyone, it's Ryan Hartung here. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to simplify the recent US credit rating downgrade from Moody's. It's a slightly longer deck than I normally do, so we're going to get right into it. Okay, so we're going to start with the big question. There's been some debate. Does the debt downgrade even matter? And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you. It's kind of yes and no. So short term, this isn't something that should be moving markets, right? So the dire backdrop of fiscal policy in the US isn't exactly a surprise. In fact, Moody's was last of the three rating agencies to downgrade the US credit rating agency or credit rating. So, you know, no one should have been caught off guard by this. The markets had to be pricing in some level of fiscal distress. However, for the longer term implications, it does point to that if we don't have a turnaround in our situation, there's risk of continued downgrades or higher perceived credit riskiness of the US as their debt load continues to rise, their interest payments become a larger part of their spending. And this has a few implications. Now, in this video, we're not going to cover these implications. However, I'm going to follow up with a second video that will walk through these four implications and what they potentially mean for the long term. But you can just read them here. It could lead to higher borrowing costs for the US, even higher interest payments than what we're already paying as we have to keep refinancing our debt at higher and higher interest rates. Higher borrowing costs across the entire economy. So this could hit consumers. Mainly in my next video, I'm going to highlight mortgage rates in particular. And then last, if the US is considered more risky, we could see weaker demand for the US dollar. So we had some content on this in our Outlook call. So our thoughts leading up to the downgrade. One risk we pointed out for this year was how bad the fiscal situation was in the US. And so as I talked about before, this table isn't set up for the Moody's downgrade yet. I'm going to have to update it, but this is the slide right from the Outlook. Fitch had downgraded U.S. credit rating in 2023, and S&P looks like it did it all the way back in 2011. So Moody's was actually the last holdout. So again, not really a surprise. But the fiscal situation long-term is certainly a risk. Now, I'm going to have to talk a lot about Trump policies in this video, just because that's what we're currently analyzing. So I wanted to include this slide here to make it clear. This is not just a Trump problem. Basically, every president since Bill Clinton, so every single administration, has contributed to, I would say, the irresponsible level of fiscal deficit we currently see. There have been spikes during crises, which could be appropriate, right? So you see the GFC, there was a spike during COVID, there was a spike as the government spends to sort of help people. However, the general trend, even if you remove those big spikes, is upwards. So this has been a long-standing sort of failure of administration after administration after administration. So again, have to talk about Trump a lot, but he is not the only person to blame here, right? He shares the blame across multiple administrations. So this is what we were worried about coming into Trump 2.0, the proposed plan. And so there were sort of three areas we were skeptical of. The first, which was his big thing, and it's being debated now, was extending his tax cuts from the previous Trump 1.0. That's very expensive. As we're seeing, it's being debated right now, and we're starting to get some numbers around it. By the time we post this video, we might have more clarity on exactly what it looks like, but we will show some estimates later in this video. Two, we were going to get revenue offsets from tariffs. We were a little skeptical of that, as we'll show in a little bit. And three, we were supposed to get spending reductions by Doge and Elon Musk. The original pledges were $2 trillion, which was incredibly unrealistic. So those were the three things we were supposed to get, right? The tax cuts, which were going to be expensive. However, we were supposed to get some additional revenue from tariffs and some spending reductions that were going to help offset it. Now, even back then, this hasn't been updated since our Outlook deck, so these numbers could be a little stale. There's been a lot of changes. But at the time, even with these projections, as you can see here, the Trump plan was going to be very, very expensive and was going to add to our debt load. So why were we worried about the tax cuts? Well, we could sort of just look to the original tax cuts. The chart here is updated through 2018, and you can see that the deficit widened rather than tightened, right? So we didn't see that, growth that is supposedly supposed to come from tax cuts, right? This simply widened the deficit, and we kind of saw no reason to believe why, if you're extending these policies, that would be any different. So we broke it out here. As you can see, tax cuts led to about 2% revenue growth, but expenditures grew by 6.7%. So the original tax cuts added to the structural deficit, and we figured 2.0 probably not going to be that different. So, but we're supposed to get the tariff write-offs or tariff revenue increases. That's a little different this time. And we're supposed to get all of these spending reductions. Let's check in on those. So we were a little skeptical on tariffs. We saw some of these targeted tariffs in 2018, and we saw the S&P fall by about 20%, sort of as they were starting to get rolling. President Trump responds to the stock market. He responds to markets. He's looking at markets. We were skeptical that if the S&P reacted similarly to previous tariff implementations that he had tried, in particular, if we were to get big retaliations from other countries, that there was a pretty good chance that the numbers we were being promised with tariffs, which, again, tariffs are inflationary. We don't think they're good policy. So we're fine with the tariff back off. But in terms of generating revenue to offset the tax cuts, we were skeptical that tariffs were going to fulfill that goal. And then we had the fiscal spending, right? So it's cutting the spending. The promise was $2 trillion. We were very skeptical of this, kind of a similar reason. If you look at Europe, which has had some austerity packages in the past, this chart sort of plotted those out with their growth during those periods. And a true $1 trillion spending cut in the US would have put GDP growth, again, we're very different from Europe, but this is just the closest example we could get, at double-digit negative numbers. So we were skeptical that, one, the administration would follow through with something like that if it led to such a large contraction. And two, if you look at the numbers here on the right, where exactly is that $2 trillion going to come from, right? So we weren't supposed to get cuts to Social Security. Medicaid, Medicare is always a touchy subject. I don't think this administration was going to cut defense spending. Even if you cut all non-defense discretionary programs, that's $1 trillion. So if you cut every single one of them blindly, that only was going to be half of the promise. And this was our concern. Basically, we had seen this in the UK during I believe it was 44 days. I should have checked before, but correct me if I'm wrong, please, in the comments. Liz Truss was PM for 44 days, and part of that was because of the bond vigilantes. So we thought U.S. policymakers should heed the lessons from the UK's 2022 experience. As you can see here, they were trying to get a budget plan through, and the 10-year yield basically said no. So it rose from about 1.8 in August of 2022, and in just a few months was up to 4.25. So that is a massive, about 3x increase, a little less than that actually, 2 and change increase in only 2 to 3 month period. Unsurprisingly, Liz Truss resigned middle of October. I think it was the shortest PM tenure in the UK's history. So this is what we were worried about. We could see a potential similar thing here in the US if our fiscal situation continued to spiral out of control. So that's what we were worried about. Let's look at how things turned out. So did we get the tariff revenue? Well, we got the walk back. So as you can see here, we have the S&P 500 here on the left. I've circled Liberation Day. The stock market was falling before that, sort of as fears of the realization of tariffs, I believe, were setting in. And then once we got the actual Liberation Day announcement that is circled, you can see the straight drop down. And then over the period of the following weeks and months, we've seen tariff walkbacks, sort of as the market reacted. And we saw the S&P recover as those policies were sort of, tough to say unwound because not all of them were put into place, but we got all those pauses, we got the reductions. The administration slightly walked back how aggressive its tariff policy was going to be. Similar thing here on the dollar. People decided to turn away following Liberation Day from U.S. assets. So we saw a sharp decrease in the value of the U.S. dollar. And both of these things played a role in the administration walking back or pausing the aggressiveness of their tariff plans. So did we get all of the tariff revenue that we were expecting? Very clear no. It's too early to tell what that number is actually going to look like. But, the most aggressive guesses of what it possibly could be, the real number is going to be well below what the expectation was, at least. So we didn't get the revenue offset. Did we get the spending cut offset? Well, yeah, title here says it all. The spending cuts didn't quite match Doge's original pledge. So this was an analysis done by BBC. The initial pledge, you can see $2 trillion. They updated that, I think, once Elon got in and was starting to work on some stuff. That was down to $1 trillion, so they cut it in half. And then if you look, that's Doge's current estimate. I believe it's 400 billion, or maybe, I think it's 170 billion. And then BBC found the savings with actual receipts was about in the $60 billion range. We have not got the spending cuts that we were promised that were supposed to offset this tax package. And then are we getting the tax package? Well, TBD, it's being debated as I record this video. There's a lot of details that we still haven't found out, but the CBO, so the Congressional Budget Office, ran an analysis, and this is the expected fiscal impact of extending the tax plan. In the top, you see the total impact on the deficit, including the additional interest. So as our deficit widens, we have to spend more and more on interest to service our debt. And then at the bottom, you just see the primary impact. So that's not including interest. And as you can see, this is supposed to add in 10 years, 4.5 trillion or 4, depending on if you include interest. I think you should. Trillion dollars to our deficit. And that expands if you look at a 20 and 30-year horizon. So we're getting some level of these tax cuts. Apologies if you can hear sirens in the background. We're getting some level of these tax cuts. We didn't get as much revenue from tariffs as we were originally expecting. And we didn't get the spending cuts that we were expecting. And bond vigilantes have made themselves known. So typically when the Fed cuts rates, or the relationship between the Fed funds rate and the 10-year is pretty strong. The Fed fund rate has a closer relationship with shorter term yields. Longer term yields are impacted by sort of the world economy and sort of longer term issues. And that's what you can see here on the right in the clip chart. As the Fed has been cutting rates since August, it hasn't cut in a while, but it did do 2 cuts. The 10-year has just continued to rise, right? So the bond markets aren't reacting the same way you would expect when the Fed was cutting rates on the short end. So the bond markets are sensing this risk. They are sensing this fiscal vulnerability, I would say. And so while the credit rating downgrade from Moody's isn't short-term news, it was probably overdue, them following the S&P and Finch. However, it does point to how vulnerable the current fiscal backdrop is, and the fact that there's just added risk in, trusting the US markets right now, especially as we are on the heels of expanding our deficit even further, right? So we haven't really shown a sign of our ability to bring in spending to decrease the deficit in any way possible. And so I think it's right for the markets to start to be a little bit concerned until someone shows that they are capable of reversing this trend. And that's what I'm going to leave you here today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Just as a reminder, I will have a follow-on that discusses the implications of these, the long-term implications, the 4 that I listed on one of the first slides here. So that'll be up sometime this weekend. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys soon.